I'm really happy to have Tim Morton back with us today. Very excited to hear what he has to say. I want to read a bit of his bio so that people who don't know him as well know what he's up to. So he is professor and Rita Shea Guffey Chair in English at Rice University, and he gave the Wellick Lectures in Theory in 2014, and has collaborated with Björk, Chaim Steinbach, and Olafur Eliasson. I personally think of him as one of the greatest lateral thinkers of our time. He's written over 160 essays in philosophy, ecology, literature, diet, art, architecture tonight, I hear, and design. And his books include Ecology Without Nature, Hyperobjects, Philosophy and Ecology After the End of the World, Realist Magic, Objects Ontology and Causality, Dark Ecology, Nothing, and his most recent book, which I'm sure he'll tell you about himself tonight. He was also our second liberal arts masterclass guest at SCI-Arc last spring, and I know many of you were in that, which was a really big success. And in a way, it continues to live on with not just through discussion, but through all of the copies of hyperobjects that we have strewn about the building like so many little blue icebergs. And so, last night he also joined our informal monthly salon over at Americano across the street, where he engaged what was really nice, undergrad, grad, and postgrad students all at once. And I'll just list a couple of the topics discussed. Topic 1, the art of amateur tarot card reading, and specifically how to avoid inadvertently pulling the death card while doing a reading of yourself. Number 2, the deep secrets hidden in the facial expressions of the Russian ambassador to the United States. And number 3, how curating an exhibition on hyperobjects is like jamming a galaxy into a matchbox, and therefore extremely easy to pull off. So, and finally, for all of you out there who wonder how Tim is so prolific in his thinking and writing, here's the thing. He's developed with a team of scientists a new technique involving a kinder, gentler way of human interaction with technology. And I can really only explain it by doing the following. Anyway, inside joke. Thank you.
Oh,
Tim,
come on. Thanks. Hello. Thank you. Yes. Oh my God, it's ever so nice to see you again. Thank you for the very touching introduction / table slap that needs to be explained to me again later, and thing that has just happened to the screen. Oh, and I've got this water, and apparently it's not open yet. It's so lovely to be, really, it's ever so nice to be here. I'm deeply, deeply touched to have been invited back again. I mean, honestly, this will never happen again after 45 minutes from now. Okay, so, and in part, it's because this lecture is called The Golden Stain of Time. I mean, what the F was I thinking when I wrote that down? I was like, I didn't actually realize it was going to be about underpants. I just thought, this is such a great phrase of John Ruskin. I've got to talk about it. I've really enjoyed this phrase for years, right? And I'm like, naively blunder into this title, and then Tom tells me last week, inferring that this is going to be about my laundry. And I was like, I had no idea about this, so I'm sort of owning it now with this kind of cadmium yellow approach to stuff. Thank you for laughing. Thank you for laughing more. Oh, it's so nice to be, can you just let me hide here or something like that? I sort of claim asylum in your lovely school. So, okay, the golden stain of time. It's a beautiful phrase, isn't it? It's haunted me because it transforms time into something you can see. A translation of time via the accidents that happen to the surfaces of buildings. It was written, of course, by John Ruskin, who was mightily opposed to the idea of cleaning buildings. See, we're getting into the depth of this stain business here. Here's the passage from the Seven Lamps of Architecture from which it comes. And you're going to need to indulge me because I really like this prose and I'm going to quote it in full. Every human action gains in honor, in grace, in all true magnificence by its regard to things that are to come. It is the far sight, the quiet and confident patience that, above all other attributes, separate man from man and near him to his maker. And there is no action nor art whose majesty we may not measure by this test. Therefore, when we build, let us think that we build forever. Let it not be for present delight, nor for present use alone. Let it be such work as our descendants will thank us for, and let us think as we lay stone on stone, that a time is to come when those stones will be held sacred because our hands have touched them, and that men will say as they look upon the labour and wrought substance of them, see, this our fathers did for us. It's a bit patriarchal, isn't it? For indeed the greatest glory of a building is not in its stones, nor in its gold. Its glory is in its age. And in that deep sense of voicefulness, of stern watching, of mysterious sympathy, nay, even of approval or condemnation, which we feel in walls that have long been washed by the passing waves of humanity. It is in their lasting witness against men, in their quiet contrast with the transitional character of all things, in the strength which, through the lapse of seasons and times, and the decline and birth of dynasties, and the changing face of the earth, and of the limits of the sea, and this sentence is going on forever, maintains its sculptured shapeliness for a time insuperable, connects forgotten and following ages with each other, and half constitutes the identity as it concentrates the sympathy of nations. It is in that golden stain of time that we are to look for the real light and colour and preciousness of architecture, and it is not until a building has assumed this character, till it has been entrusted with the fame and hallowed by the deeds of men, till its walls have been witnesses of suffering and its pillars rise out of the shadows of death, that its existence, more lasting as it is than that of the natural objects of the world around it, can be gifted with even so much as these possess of language and of life. There's a lot to say about this passage, and I'm only going to be able to touch on it a little bit. What's particularly interesting for me is that Ruskin sees the stain as intrinsic to the building, not as an accident. Stains tend to be accidents, don't they? I'm afraid there's going to be rather a lot of this sort of childish humour in this lecture. It's not easy to avoid it. If you think the stain of time is intrinsic to a building, it means that you are cleaving to an implicit, if never directly articulated, object-oriented ontology. That's because OOO holds that time isn't some special extra thing that contains other entities. Time is a feature of the basic structure of things. Time is a kind of liquid that pours out of things. So the stain of time is something that shows you how time is pouring out of a building, which, come to think of it, is quite strange, because here we have what in the business of literary criticism is called a chiasmus, a sort of cruciform figure that exchanges one term for another in a contrary motion. The most famous one right now is obviously JFK's, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. And if you think about it, that reversal isn't completely symmetrical. It's set up to appear so, but it isn't. We might talk about that a bit later. But for now, just notice that what's being implied is that the things that happen to a building, the dirt, which we'll think about a little more even sooner than thinking about chiasmus, are evidence of how buildings happen. Which means that what a building is a kind of ex-building, which I was sort of saying last time. Some guy called Tim Morton was, I swear, talking about this with you last time. Can you ever get out of this crazy loop? If you recall, part of thinking about symbiosis and evolution and other phenomena involves a very curious ontological feature of how things are. They are ghosted by spectral versions of themselves that are not optional or accidental. Stop the tape of evolution and you'll see a life form ghosted by some X-power that doesn't make sense. Say, for example, it's a fish that can breathe out of water for 5 minutes. The other fish are a bit freaked out by this fish. If they happen to be fishist, they might try to exclude the X-fish from the benefits of the fish category altogether. But since evolution is driven by random mutation, so that you can never successfully distinguish at the time between a monstrosity and a variation, because those terms only make sense backwards, aka retroactively, there's no way to draw a nice, neat, rigid line around the fish species in question. And yet, and for the same reasons, we're talking about this exact little fish. Look, there it goes, darting through the water with its cute orange stripes, and we're not talking about frogs or viruses or jacarandas. A fish, in order to be just this exact fish, is ghosted by its ex-fish spectral double. I'm arguing, in fact, that our building can be stained by other stuff, to use the kind of highly technical vocabulary I've developed over the years, because it's already stained by itself. And I hope this paradox doesn't sound too utterly outlandish at this point. The building is already stained by its uncanny ex-building form, and this is only because it has an appearance, which is a terribly simple reason for such a superpower, isn't it? Because it has a structural ontological difference between what it is and how it appears. The building is intrinsically flawed. All buildings are a bit wonky, I'm sure you'll agree, and not just because you have to fit them next to other stuff and make them cope with other stuff, which makes them vulnerable to still other stuff that's different from the stuff you designed the building to cope with, and I'm sure my lucidity is rubbing off on you as I speak. If you clean the building, however, this might imply that you think that there's a genuine building underneath its present appearance, which might imply that you think there's a genuine substance underneath present appearances in general, which also implies that what is genuine keeps going on and on and on continuously, say from 1517 to 2017, which also implies that time is a linear succession of now points coagulated together by some kind of mystery glue that makes one of them capable of being a stepping stone to the next one, such that the past is made of now points that happen to be over there. I usually think that the past is to my left, because that's how I was taught to read, and that over there is measurably different from over here in the here and now, which in turn implies that this temporal line is sitting in some kind of dimension that allows you to measure it like that, and what could that be other than time itself? So that you can count the number of temporal units it would take to get from the contemporary now point to the 1517 now point. And this means that you're a bit of an idiot. It's time for a drink, isn't it, yeah? And this means that you're a bit of an idiot who hasn't actually explained anything like what you were trying to explain. Because you require time to explain the very temporal logic you're using to argue that there's a genuine building underneath the building's appearance. Does this mean I don't think you should repair or clean buildings? No, it doesn't. In that case, I'd also be advocating some kind of metaphysics of presence, because that's what we're talking about, the view that resists the strange features of the time-stain concept, according to which there's a genuine state of a building and a not genuine one, and it's too bad you're living in a broken hovel with bits of broken bridge and road and stuff, because that's just the way things are in America right now. We don't believe in infrastructure anyway, it's all just information nowadays. Bridges are for people who've never so much as heard of Oculus, and so on and so on. But we have, and by we I mean mostly white Western people, turned the dial quite a ways towards the clean end of the spectrum, and it might be a good idea, ecologically speaking, at least, to turn it a little bit towards the dirty end. Because what dirt is, of course, is evidence of what I'm now calling the symbiotic real. This is all stuff from my book. It's called Humankind. I tried to think of the most irritating word that Marxists would hate. Yeah. So the title is being published by Verso. They're being very nice about it. And the subtitle is Solidarity with Non-Human People. The symbiotic real. And it's made up mostly of bits of life forms, mashed. And the building itself might have been designed with repelling such things in mind, making its surfaces nice and easy wipe, and this repulsion can only work according to a certain temporal scale, so that the building costs as much as it takes to maintain the temporal scale on which it appears to be nice and pristine, like you have to wash the windows every few weeks no matter what, and this employs all kinds of cleaners and dangerous ladders and stuff. Or you've made this building out of overkill materials that will resist weathering for hundreds of years longer than necessary. And the temporal scale you're working on hasn't much to do with the temporal scales of the other structures around, some of which are made by spiders and birds and the like. And of course, all kinds of different temporality structures can overlap in a building, so that your building really is a sort of poem about time, with all kinds of different temporal images, rhymes, rhythms, and tropes. When I teach how to read poems, which I'm doing this term in fact, I teach some stuff about the different aspects or layers of a poem's unfolding. I call them structure, texture, perception, and narration. Structure has to do with very basic things such as the lineation of the poem, how the lines sit in relation to one another, and the syntax, how the phrases are joined together or not. And the most basic feature of all is what some people call space. But that's because they're not thinking carefully about what they're trying to explain. So I changed the term to physical architecture. Here's what I mean. The poem is made of squiggles on or in some kind of physical medium, such as a page made of paper, or a screen made of pixels, or a room full of air that can be turned into pressure waves, or a combination of all kinds of media. The first question to ask about a poem, and it's a very basic environmental question, is what is the relationship between the squiggles and the physical architecture the poem is sitting in? Some poems just plow ahead and ignore their physical format. They don't care whether they've been inscribed on a sheet of parchment with a quill pen or singed onto the fur of a cat or found randomly in a configuration of rocks on the surface of Mars. There's a strong contrast between the poem and what it's sitting in, and this is typical of poems in European languages up until about the middle of the 19th century, which is when Ruskin wrote The Seven Lamps of Architecture and Mallarmé wrote Un coup de dé. In that poem, it's as if he's written it on a rubber sheet that he then stretches and bends in all kinds of ways so that the words pull away from one another or crowd together in unexpected ways. The so-called space around the poem becomes part of the poem, which always happens. It's just that this poem is doing it deliberately, and to that extent, whatever its content, it's an environmental poem. In the same way, and I hope this doesn't sound too clunky, all architecture is landscape architecture. All right, it sounded clunky, but perhaps you see the point. What's interesting, of course, is that landscape architecture is often construed to be the poor relation of architecture, which is sort of like writing poems without regard to the surfaces, whether 2D or 3D or more they're written on, and I apologize in advance, or actually retroactively at this point, if I've just said like a thing that makes me be the devil. I'm very sorry. I always say the devil thing in any social situation. And I've probably just said it, so I'm deeply, deeply sorry. I sort of volunteer for it unconsciously, like Donkey in Shrek, you know, like, pick me, I'll be the scapegoat guy who says the wrong thing. Aristotle gives you a good reason why a cat is as good as a piece of paper for writing a poem on. That's because the essence of a thing is its form, its morphe. A cup made of porcelain gets the job of being a cup done just as well as a cup made of plastic. Of the four causes, material, efficient, formal, and final, these are Aristotle's four causes, right? What it's made of, how it works, what the shape is, and what it's for, right? The least important is the material one. The efficient one, how it works, is less important as the formal cause, the kind of structure it has. And this formal cause is also hitched to another important cause, the final one. What the thing is for. The final cause of a tragedy, for example, might be to make you cry and feel scared, and so various forms are employed to cause that to happen, whether the tragedy is made of human actors or Muppets, and whether it's a movie or a stage play or what have you. Thanks to Aristotle, you don't have to care so much about things. Since the essence of Greece, for example, is in its form and in what it's for, and since what it's made of, lots of different types of people, for example, and how it works, some kind of very limited democracy, say, aren't as important as what its form is and what it's for. You've just given Alexander the Great all the conceptual tools he needs to justify invading large swathes of land to the east and enslaving people, or turning them into Greek people. Aristotle supplies you with a sort of civilization in a box that you can unpack and unleash anywhere you like. It doesn't matter that where you just landed is made of sand, or subtropical savanna, or swamp. You can pitch your Greekness there, no problem. What it's for and what it looks like can just pop out of the handy philosophical box that Aristotle gave you. Kant gives you another upgraded version of upgraded reason why a cat is as good as a piece of paper for writing a poem on. And that's for a strange different reason, namely that the cat in question is in fact more like a piece of paper than a cat. The trouble is that Kant is fiendishly half right, and easier to accept than the seemingly superficially easier Aristotle. That's because whereas it would take a lot of fancy theological footwork to prove what Aristotle wants you to think about, namely the existence of substances that remain constant if their form remains constant, underneath certain appearances called accidents and designated as superfluous. Kant makes it much easier insofar as he points out that every time you reach for the thing, say it's some kind of yellow brick, no matter how you reach for it, you won't be able to access the actual brick in itself. You're going to access brick data, which for sure is about bricks, but brick data isn't bricks, it's data. And he lets slip through, although he tries to make sure you don't notice, that this happens no matter what your access mode is. Officially, Kant holds that thinking is the top access mode, and that somehow the thinking, transcendental subject, gets to make the brick real, to realize it like a director or a producer making a movie, or like a conductor interpreting a piece of music, or like reading a poem, bringing these squiggles to life as a poem. The trouble is you have to do a lot of fancy metaphysical, nay theological footwork in that direction if you're going to go along with Kant as opposed to Aristotle. No. The easy bit is, and Kant lets it slip as an example, which is why he was scared of using them, is that no access mode whatever will be able to wrap itself around the whole of that brick in the best or most proper way. You can think about the brick. That will give you brick thoughts. You can lick the brick. That will give you brick licks. Jesus, this will now start to sound like Dr. Seuss. Luke Luck licks lakes. You can brush the brick. You will obtain brick brushings. You can interview the brick. This will give you a brick interview, which won't be very verbose either. You can ignore the brick. This will give you a fuzzy cloud of brick-shaped ignorance. You can put the brick in your building. This will give you a brick building. See the trouble? One of the cool things about the trouble is that any access mode at all is equally rubbish at Pac-Manning the brick once and for all. And this means that non-humans, from flies who land on the brick, to bacteria that digest the brick, to Pac-Man that eats the brick in an example about object withdrawal in a lecture, are equally as good or bad at grasping the brickness as thinking, which anthropocentrism, bless its dear little heart, has tended to confine to just one corner of the universe, aka the one where we're at, the humans. Okay, that's the cool bit. And now for the uncool bit, the bit that OOO is rejecting. Remember, OOO is cool with the withdrawal of the Kantian brick, but it's not cool with the anthropocentric workaround I was just sketching, whereby thinking becomes the right access mode. One reason for this is that how Kant has been interpreted has been like someone with partial hearing at a mixing desk. This person has two faders to control. One fader is the correlator fader, the entity that gets to do the accessing. The other fader is the correlatee fader, the brick in this case. Traditionally, on the Kantian mixing desk, only one fader has been turned up anywhere near loud, the right channel, the correlator fader. The correlatee fader has tended to be turned way, way down. This enhances the sense of human power. Hegel goes so far as to get rid of the left channel altogether. It's like someone who thinks that a really cool mono remix of Kant will be better than the original stereo. The point being that since this inaccessibility of the brick in itself is an idea happening in the thought stream of the transcendental subject, it's not always true, it's just an idea. So there's no real inaccessibility because the brick isn't even a brick at all until the subject has posited it as such. Hooray! Problem solved. We've eliminated the distortion in the mix by breaking the mixing desk, by getting rid of the correlatee fader altogether. It was turned way down in any case. Who's going to miss it? And the net effect of all this is that the brick itself isn't really a brick at all. It's a cinema screen or a monitor on which can be projected whatever ontological format the correlator wishes, the lovely, benevolent human being who has everyone else's best interest at heart. Jump a few decades forwards in the 19th century. You're holding a copy of Capital Volume 1 in your sweating hands. It's a real page-turner, actually. It's like a detective story. The investigation concerns how the heck do capitalists actually make any money? It's not because they pay people not enough money. It's not because they jack up their prices. Just try owning a house. Soon the idea that you're going to get rich evaporates as you realize all the other houses around you are increasing in value at the same time. And all the money you didn't pay the workers to make the brick or whatever is also not being paid to the workers who make the other stuff. So you're not making money like that either anyway. Capitalist economic theory knows about that already. I mean, gee whiz, strike me down with a feather. You're saying that this brick was made by someone? Wow, I didn't know that. If it was as easy as pointing out that and then doing something about it, like raising someone's wages, communism would have happened everywhere by now. Marx argues that one thing that's weird about capitalist economics is that it turns things like bricks and tables and coats into monitors that display the fluctuations of value rather than stuff you can eat of or wear. Now that's actually what commodity fetishism actually is, right? And he says that this is far weirder than if the table or whatever were to get up and move around, whether by its own force or by some kind of telekinesis. That's what he really says. That's what he really means by commodity fetishism. It's precisely not about believing in anything like the agency of non-human or inanimate beings. It's about the fact that these beings, caught within the system he's describing, are transmogrified into little components of a gigantic distributed artificial intelligence software that computes value based on homogeneous abstract labor time. the little bit of the system that's attached to the something outside it, aka the worker's body, since she has to sell herself in order to buy back a little bit of herself at the end of the day, aka working to live rather than living to work, or however you like to put it. It's not even painful necessarily, and your boss might be totally into socialism or whatever, but it's still happening because it's got nothing to do with human intention at all. It has to do with this hyper-object-like artificial intelligence network that uses things like the coat you're wearing as a monitor for value projection purposes. Despite his anthropocentrism then, Marx does allow one thing other than humans to have agency, and that's this artificial intelligence. And according to his logic, this AI is a very bad thing. All that singularity stuff and all that worry about robots replacing us and stuff is a projection. It's very much already happened. No wonder some academic Marxists are really worried about OOO. But OOO is actually saying that the brick isn't a monitor either. The capitalist AI doesn't access the total brick in itself either. And this seems to be pretty much in line with what Marx half means by use value. Use value is when you access stuff, and its basic mode is pleasure. Production doesn't mean making things in a factory, it means biting into a peach and letting the juice run down your chin. So at least there's a peach, and it's juicy and stuff, not just an AI display terminal. Now I did just say this seems to be pretty much in line with what Marx himself half means, because there is another half, which is that Marx has inherited from Hegel a not good tendency to make mono remixes of Kant, because it's easier on the ear or something. In the mono remix, the peach isn't really a peach until you've accessed it, which for Marx means bringing it within the sphere of human economic relations. We're not talking about buying and selling peaches yet. We're talking still about use value, not exchange value. Logically, prior to exchanging stuff is enjoying stuff, and in the enjoyer is what for Marx makes a thing real, realizes it in the conductor and musical score way I was just describing. Can you see how Marx's theory has a really pernicious bug, which ironically consists in a lack of consideration for actual bugs, not to mention pigeons, Animal from the Muppet Show, bits of brick powder, and Tom's hairdo. And in this book I just finished, that calls for a sip of water, doesn't it? It's a drinking game. And in this book I just finished, like right here yesterday in the Standard Hotel in downtown LA, it's called Humankind, Solidarity with Non-Human People, I'm arguing that this is a bug, not a feature of Marxism. When you remove the bug, you find the whole thing works better, or in fact works at all, because I'm arguing that it's not just that it would be nice to expand condescendingly the sphere of beings in which Marxism could be interested to include Cecil the lion. I'm arguing that Marxism only works when you do that. In your face, haters. And now that I've argued it in this simple way, I think you can see why. There's an unnecessary and violent idealism lurking away in the Marxist thought software. The trouble is, when you remove it, you realize you're starting to sound like Yoda. And most of academic life since Kant has been set up so as not to sound like the Yoda stuff that is the secret ingredient that actually makes the whole correlationism thing work at all. It's just that you must never ever point that out loud. It's so not cool to sound like this, for example. And I'm so sorry, I can't do the Frank Oz, yeah? I'm just going to say, for my ally, I can't do it. For my ally is the force. And a powerful ally it is. Life creates it, makes it grow. Its energy surrounds and binds us. Luminous beings are we, not this crude matter. He does the stick poking bit there. You must feel the force around you, here between you, me, the rock, the tree, everywhere. Yes, even between the land and the ship. That's like really, really, really bad. What were we thinking? We couldn't possibly get behind an army of Marxist Yodas. That would be ridiculous. A giant army of Jedi capable of levitating the White House and pushing it into outer space because... Wait a minute. Anywho, so the point is, just to get a bit technical, the non-Althusserian pre-capital alienation theory of ideology is right, but for the wrong reasons. And that's because there is indeed something that escapes the clutches of ideology, not because there's an intrinsic, vanilla, continuous, substantial nature underneath appearances, the Aristotelian essentialist version that the cool kids are right to be suspicious of, but because of good old object withdrawal, which means in turn that the stuff that differs from its appearance isn't just the human being, but also the brick, the Jim Henson puppet, Frank Oz's voice, goldfish, and black Audis. And in turn this means that the Althusserian theory just to get technical again, the post-epistemological break, Marx, of Capital, who holds that ideology is all pervasive and has no outside and so forth, that theory is wrong for the right reasons, right? So the pre-one is like right for the wrong reasons, and this one is like wrong for the right reasons, yeah? And the good old alienation theory is right for the wrong reasons, and the cool kids theory is wrong for the right reasons. That's because it's true that you can't access the outside of your access mode by definition. Yet this doesn't mean that access modes and data are all there is. Wow, this OOO is really working. We've just solved a decades-long, very technical debate within Marx's theory, and all you have to do is accept a little bit of yodification, and it's all good. What's not to like? Now, this is where we get to go back to the Ruskin and find some interesting stuff in it. And as a side note, the kind of art that Ruskin championed, the pre-Raphaelite stuff, has had such a rough ride from the Hegelian Marxists who accused it of being culinary art, note the patriarchal put down about cooking, and kitsch, aka it's like a fascist bouillon cube that'll make a really powerful Nazi soup if you know what you're doing. And for whatever reason, I just adore the pre-Raphaelites, I can't help it. One cool thing about them is that the hyper-detail in their work defeats a foreground-background distinction that is implicitly anthropocentric. When the leaves and flowers are just as detailed as Ophelia floating down that stream, you've gone a long way towards an ecological art. Which brings us to Ruskin thinking about that elusive form, the Gothic. So the way a building's appearance differs from its essence is its fragility, and this difference is how the building is really a slinky that flops over itself, lopsided, and the name of this flopping is time. One implication is that a building can never be totally integrated. A temporarily frozen slice of building is going to be flopping over itself already, like when you hit pause on an old VHS video and the image on the screen flickers back and forth without settling on a single shot. Buildings have temporal parts just as they do spatial ones. There's the building in 1600, the building in 1800, the building 2 million years from now when it's mostly a cloud of powder dispersed in the air and some compacted mineral stratum in the ground. What I'm saying is that there is no way to find a truly solid or static temporal part of the building. There are, however, and this is something Ruskin argues in The Nature of Gothic, that some architectures make this intrinsic brokenness explicit. And this explicitness is also a signal of the way the humans who made the building were treated. Were they permitted by the stringencies of the building's construction to exercise their creativity? This is what Ruskin says. Wherever the workman is utterly enslaved, the parts of the building must, of course, be absolutely like each other, for the perfection of his execution can only be reached by exercising him in doing one thing and giving him nothing else to do. The degree in which the workman is degraded may thus be known at a glance by observing whether the several parts of the building are similar or not, and if, as in Greek work, all the capitals are alike and all the mouldings unvaried, then the degradation is complete. If, as in Egyptian or Ninevite work, though the manner of executing certain figures is always the same, the order of design is perpetually varied, the degradation less total. If, as in Gothic work, there is perpetual change both in design and execution, the workman must have been altogether set free. Yay! Now, the point of this passage is that the worker gets to be more in charge of different kinds of production, aka different kinds of pleasure, for no particular reason in the Gothic mode of proceeding. But the less obvious point, by the way, I'm not endorsing Gothic stuff, I'm just sort of like, this is the argument bit, yeah? But the less obvious point, and this is my conclusion here, is that so does the building and the building's parts. Rather than being subsumed to some teleological aim in which they lose their distinctiveness, they're allowed to wiggle around and differ from the overall structure. And now to bring it back to our main theme of time stains. Recall how Ruskin writes, "It is in their lasting witness against men, in their quiet contrast with the transitional character of all things." In the larger passage I quoted, he's saying directly, on the one hand, that the building is sanctified by human pleasure, whether directly to do with the building or not. He's saying that human access ennobles the building, literally coating it with a patina that is the signal of human access above and beyond deliberate access or thought access. The total style of humans as humans, their human kindness, as I'm now calling it, what they are despite what they think they are or how they appear to be acting, but the total phenomenon of the hyperobject called the human species is what gets recorded on the buildings as if it were a microphone or a photographic plate lying in wait for eons, picking up data in the form of dust so that you can see the immensity of the massively distributed hyperobject of which you're a tiny piece, it's the stain of the human. On the other hand, and yet in a directly related sense, this stain belongs not to you or to me, or to any human in particular, and of course it must include evidence of all kinds of non-human beings. In this way, the building is evidence of the symbiotic real, of how humans are ghosted by ex-humans at every point: stomach bacteria, pigeons, human hands, rats, exhaust, smoke, bombs, radiation, the human body as an entity that is by no means captured by my ability to think about it. And it signals the withdrawn depth of the building as such, as if you could see the unseeable, or at least the shadow of the unseeable. Perhaps in a way, it's like how Kant's aesthetic dimension involves us in a telepathic mind meld with another being that might well not be alive, let alone sentient, let alone conscious, let alone human. And how this experience of beauty allows us to glimpse what is withdrawn for Kant, a sort of think feel, like the mouth feel PR people talk about when it comes to potato chips. In this case, perhaps what is revealed by the building and its stain, which ghosts and reveals the buildingness of the building, is something we could call time feel. The golden stain of time is a record of all kinds of buildings, all kinds of beings, but above and beyond that it records and highlights the difference of the building from itself, which just is time as such, not in time, but as time, of time. Time is nowhere else, the golden stain of time. Thank you. So I may pace about a bit now, Mr. Man with the microphone. That may happen. I'm warning you. I'm obviously super happy to take questions or whatever. Thank you. Hey, thanks. Thank you. That's awesome. Or not. Sort of stand here like a lemon. You know, look at the cadmium yellow lemon. Maya lemon. Yeah, go.
So really fantastic and fun to watch as always. So first, thank you.
Cheers.
But second, I couldn't help to think all the way through that there are kind of two parallel withdrawals going on, I think, if I heard it correctly. One is the withdrawal of the building from itself, which you described very eloquently. The other is the withdrawal of the architecture from the building.
Yeah, good point, yeah.
And the way that I've described this in the past is that, you know, the building can't be reduced to the architecture cannot be reduced to the building, right? It always somehow exceeds it or misses it or in some way doesn't align. And the way you see this is whenever you go to a building with the architect and the architect says, well, that's not supposed to be that way.
Right.
And they immediately invoke this non-present alternative doppelganger of the building that exists somewhere else.
Yeah.
And so where that gets tricky is that it begins to open up a line of thinking that would allow you to think of the architecture as kind of too much the product of the intentionality of the author.
Could be.
But after hearing your talk, I realized that there's a kind of tangle in that the architecture is withdrawn from the building is withdrawn from itself, and they're all kind of bumping into each other.
Totally, yeah.
And the author's intention is also kind of in the scrum as well.
Totally.
And so that's just what's on my mind.
No, that's really great.
And I wonder how you would roll the withdrawal of the architecture from the building into the argument about the withdrawal of the building from the building.
Well, sort of like I would probably say, I think I was sort of trying to say that the reason why it withdraws from the architecture is because it withdraws from itself first. Not chronologically first, but logically first. It's primordially, fundamentally different from itself at every point in such a way that you can never like isolate a bit of it that has a little kind of building equivalent of an Intel Inside chip in it, label on it that says this is a part of this building and nothing else, right? And sort of like everything is like that, right? Like and sometimes now the word I use is open. I like to say open right? Like Tim is open, the building is open, as opposed to withdraw, because withdraw automatically makes you visualize this movement, right? And like, in a way, it's not that, it's more like open, yeah? Like, Tim is Tim, but he's made of all kinds of things that aren't Tim, right? And like, that's how Tim can like actually do stuff, because if Tim was completely like, solidly, totally Tim all the way through, like a stick of Brighton rock, right, that says a present from Brighton all the way down, right, then he couldn't actually do anything. Nothing could happen. There'd be no sort of wiggle room for anything to happen, right? And so sort of like, there's less of Tim than he likes to think, But that's why stuff can happen, right? Like, when you're married in America, there's this weird ontological truth in the tax code that treats you like 1.5 people. Like, so when you get married, you become 3/4 of a person, right? Which is sort of psychologically true, and like apparently taxally true as well, right? And sort of like there's less of you than you thought, yeah. I sort of get there a little bit again through the poems, because the thing about my day job, which is like interpreting works of literature, you've only got these words on a page. That's all you've got, right? So you try to stabilize the meaning by contextualizing it somehow. Like, so for example, you say that, well, the building's actually totally referring to the architecture, that designed it or whatever. Or it's totally, like the author could be lots of things, right? Like the author of the poem could be capitalism, humans, Charles Dickens' family relations, the 1850s, the time of human beings on Earth, right? Like the author could be lots of things, right? But when you look for the author, you also find a text of some kind that involves another kind of interpretation. So you have a kind of infinite regress. And so what's funny about contextual criticism, actually, in general, is that it is in fact a desperate attempt to stop the context explosion from happening. Like to sort of stop it at some point. Go like, okay, now we've stabilized it, and then now we've explained it, because this context is more real than what it's trying to explain, right? And so sort of like, these thoughts occur to you more and more and more as you read the poem, so you sort of think, well, this poem is really obviously what it is, it's not another poem, but whenever I try to stabilize the meaning or the authorship, it kind of slips away like the soap in the bath, right? It's sort of like that, yeah. And so that would be the reason why the architecture also withdraws from the building, right? Because the building itself, the poem itself, whatever, my answer is definitely withdrawing from itself and from your expectation of what answers are right now. So maybe I'll just like stop the answer thing.
Hey, Tim.
Hello, David.
Hello. Oh. I might, I'm trying to gather my thoughts here, so forgive me if it's not entirely clear at first. Something I tell my students a lot when we're too much in autopilot about presenting our work in front of an audience is don't freak out too much about it, because what the hell do you expect to be at the front door of the building to explain your concept when people arrive? You know, like on some level, it will always be doomed to be misunderstood beyond your intentions. So there has to be some focus, maybe, I'm going to use this word very sloppily, like on the building itself, on the thing itself. Right. And it's always been a kind of an odd thing that in architecture we have some idea of designing the building itself. And then how we conceptualize it or develop rhetoric to persuade people to build it, or whatever weird purposes we have in talking about it, right? So I think probably a couple of my students are here from my studio this term, probably because of what's going on in the world right now. I wanted to think a little bit about the role of research and knowledge in making things that maybe have nothing to do with research or making things. I mean, research or knowledge ultimately, right? So I started thinking that a kind of secondary problem of doing research is the problem of remembering it later. like, okay, here are 10 things that I thought were really important for my research, and I know I'm going to need to remember it later when I want to try to make decisions about what I'm designing.
Yes.
Okay, so how do I write it down so that I could remember? How do I store it so that I could retrieve it later? Right?
You're making me smile because remembering for me has to do with all my flies undone. It happens every time I do a lecture. I get paranoid. I didn't do my flies up. It's like a thing. Like, how can I remind myself? And I've remembered too late that that's my problem. Well, sorry.
Well, all right, continuing, rolling with this. So we both know there is no such thing as perfect retrieval, especially the moment we decide to write it down, right?
Yeah.
Now, anticipating that it's going to get fucked up when we try to retrieve it, we might set it up so that we'll misretrieve it in an interesting way.
Nice.
Right?
Yeah.
So it's a kind of idea of trying to make the knowledge itself maybe a little bit more open in a sense, or like to let the thing withdraw and anticipate it a little bit, or to have a practice of dealing with that withdrawal or that openness, right? So here is the punchline, the question.
Yeah.
Something that's been a bit of a difficult question lurking for me during this is
bracing for impact.
What is the difference really between misreading or opening up the thing itself or the facts to something more open, right? Or estranged or whatever word we use, versus say like what's going on in the world right now with like the fake news or the mangling of facts and the misinterpreting. Like I read something on Breitbart, and therefore now Obama,
you can just say anything. Just say anything.
Right?
Just say anything you want.
So like what? How would you make a distinction between maybe the right way to do it or wrong? I know that's a terrible way to put it.
No, it's beautiful because it's on my mind all the time.
Yeah, so and it's. I'm curious to get your thoughts.
Yeah, like, can you still be accurate in a truth domain where you know that the true-false distinction is a little bit fuzzy, to say the least? Like, that's the simple way of putting it, right? And sort of like, and does that mean that I think that all news is fake news, right? See, the thing is, if all news was fake news, then you'd know it was fake news, so it wouldn't be fake news in a certain way. Like, if you knew everything was a lie, then you'd know something true, except for the fact that that sentence also must be a lie, right? And so, actually, you kind of don't, right? And sort of what you know then is that the true-false distinction is nice and fuzzy. Like, how do you even like have that impulse to want to prove something is accurate, right, or know what the truth is, right? It's because there is some kind of truth. There is some kind of true-false distinction. There is true and false, right? It's just that they kind of flicker between one another in a disturbing way, right? You can have fake news because you can have actual news, right? It's sort of like that, right? And so in fact, your ability to discriminate the fake news depends very much, unfortunately, on this kind of flickering truth space, right? And this is actually very important politically, actually, because funnily enough, on the Democrat side of life, we've got people who are really into like delivering data as a mode of being true, right? And so you open up the newspaper if you're into like ecological stuff, and you see this stuff every day, and it's very, very, very depressing and disturbing, and it's a complete drag, and I really don't want to know it, right? Because it's sort of like 5%, 100,000, 2, 50, 5 weeks, 10 years, 6, I say all these different numbers every day, right? Sort of like as if just by stating those interpretations of data, you were saying something true and also persuading people, right? On the other hand, in the red corner, we have the fake news people who are all about just tweaking people's emotion, right? Just that, right? Like, I really, really like Lakoff, you know, the linguist, Berkeley, and he had a very great insight actually a while ago, which is that left-wingish people on the TV say, look, right, like Obama's like, look, which is automatically kind of condescending. It's like, you're not looking in the right place. Here's the facts over here, right? Whereas your right-wing talk show host is like, see? Right? And see validates what's on your mind, what you're feeling. See? Right? If only these guys could get behind C, right? These guys need to get behind that, right? And so that's the big picture. It's very urgent, actually. You know, it's sort of one reason why I love the John Olivers of this world, right? Because they supplement the political sort of speech rules that they seem to have on that side of things, which is very sort of dry and careful and sober and kind of Sam the American Eagle, right? But then like Sam the American Eagle, but with like a funky, nice, smiley, twisty bit extra, right? Which actually isn't just an optional extra, it's the thing that actually contains, in a way, the truth. It's not just a decoration, right? It's actually like that kind of comedy, that kind of laughter is phenomenologically equivalent to knowing something true, right? Like when you laugh at a joke, it's the same thing almost as like having an insight, right? It's like with the idea sucked out, but like the emotion of it, like, oh, right, click, right? That's why you laugh, right? And so there's something about that, right, that could provide a pathway towards thinking that even though what we've only got are access modes, there's no way of getting outside of the access mode, right? So that the thing that you're analyzing, the building, the poem, whatever it is a complete, like a sort of flame, right? And then like what you think the building is and what you think you are and what you think your ideas about it are like percolate out from this total phenomenon, right? But that doesn't mean there isn't something real and genuine happening. What it means is that but you can actually describe this thing very accurately, right? You can describe the dynamics of its arising extremely accurately, yeah? And you don't have to worry that you're in a kind of non-science-y sort of truth space there, actually. You're not in fake news world. You're in like the the phenomenology of science world, like what having a scientific insight, sort of how that appears, right? I'm trying very hard to avoid the word experience, which is why I'm taking a long time to say this, because experience is a certain way in which that phenomenon gets like cashed out by some belief about what's going on. And so often when people say phenomenological, they usually just mean experiential, which is actually completely untrue, right? But this is also big, and this is sort of why the word phenomenologist now is like, sounds like the word hippie to some scholars. Like when they use the word, it's the same as like a punk, a hippie, like in a very negative way, right? It's like a bad thing, you know, because you're all just about experience, and experience is an illusion and all that, right? But no, whatever is called experience is actually where the causality is happening, according to this logic, which we could kind of go into a bit more if you've got another 5 hours. I can prove it, but like how the stuff actually works, right? How things actually work, not just like how they are experienced. That dimension is where stuff happens, actually, you know. And you know, like this is how like you can feel the building and think about the building and all that. All these things are causal relationships, right? Happening in this aesthetic domain, right? And they can be described accurately, just like you can say with pretty good certainty that Twinkle Twinkle Little Star is really different from Das Boot. You know, that's the stuff that occurs to me off the top of my head. But like, you can't ever really, really super know that, you know. But nevertheless, it's accurate, right? You just have to kind of reframe what you think accurate means, right? Accurate means, you know what the signal of accuracy is? Actually ambiguity, funnily enough. Like most like truth searches are trying to get rid of the ambiguity. Like if we strip the ambiguity off, we're going to get down to like the basic point, right? Now, I've had LASIK. The last time I was in this building, I was with the glasses, yeah? And it was a fantastic, okay, I mean, wow. Like, first of all, they give you 2 Valiums, the like of which I've never seen in my life. These are like double the diameter of M&Ms, yeah? And then they give you this ibuprofen. I'm not into drugs at all. And it's shaped like an egg, like one of those little Easter eggs with the candy coating around it. You swallow it. Then you sit outside the operating theatre and they're playing Girls Just Want to Have Fun by Cyndi Lauper. And you're like, wow, could be like a psychopath killing room situation, because that's the kind of song they play when they chop you into little bits. I wonder what's going to happen. I'm on Valium, so I don't care. You go in and they give you this plushy dog. They stroke the dog, look at the green light. Like, wow, then the green light goes really fuzzy. And then you're like, wow, they must have sliced my eye open, you know, because the green light's gone really fuzzy. Ooh, that's interesting. In a kind of Salvador Dali, chien andalou, I'm reacting to this really well. I thought it was going to be totally horrified. So then, you know, the next day and then for months and months afterwards, you have all these eye tests, right? Many eye tests. And they put you through the stuff that they put you through when you're having an eye test, right? And you all know that when you're at the eye doctor, they always get it down to something very ambiguous, right? They're like, is it number 1 or number 2? Number 1 or number 2? And you're like, fucking, either of them are equally slightly wrong, right? Like, this one is kind of wrong in that way, and this one's kind of wrong in that way. Like, I guess I could go with either. The doctor just found the accurate prescription for you, because you could go with either. So the ambiguity, which is that you could go with either, is in that particular thing, syndrome moment, as a signal of accuracy, right? So if you can break down what you're analyzing to something fundamentally ambiguous that you can't resolve, it means that you're onto something, right? You can use that as like the lighted signs that will take you to the exit of the plane of worrying about whether you're right or not, right? Funnily enough, right? So that you can actually use this flickering between true and false as the guide rail to like knowing stuff that's true, right? If you over-apply the idea that true is different from false, then you're not going to be able to get there, actually, and you're going to create all kinds of funny problems as you try to eliminate the ambiguity, right? Because the ambiguity, funnily enough, is a fundamental feature of how things are. Like, my eye is finite and physical, therefore, there's never going to be the perfect prescription for it, because the optician stuff withdraws from the eye as well as the architecture withdrawing from the building, right? And so there's going to be a good enough one, right? There's going to be one that's good enough that stops me from dying when I drive and all that, right? And so this good enough is different from fake news, actually, right?
There's a difference between like trying to get that ambiguous prescription versus, oh, there's no such thing as sight.
Exactly.
There's nothing
right.
to
There's no
see.
such thing as
Poke your
sight.
eyes out.
Yeah, exactly. Have these, right, John, you know, have these Elton John glasses with feathers on them that don't actually do anything, because eyes don't really exist. It's all just like pretendy stuff, right? Is that helping to like start, you know, like a thing that gets rid of the thing that I can never say because I can't stand him? Yes, right, like that, you can use that paradox as a signal that you're onto something. And like it's keyed to the limitations of your ability to tolerate paradox, right? But that's okay, because everything is keyed to something like that, right? There's no such thing as some kind of pure, unmediated, something experience, fact, truth, whatever. Like any physicist will tell you this, right? They call it confirmation bias, right? We call it hermeneutic circle because we're super cool in the humanities building, and we know Greek stuff, right? And they call it confirmation bias, which is like, if you want to find something, then you're going to find it in the data. If your setup, whatever it is about wanting to find something, you know, you're probably going to find that pattern somehow in the data. It's going to confirm. They just figured this out, right? And all of a sudden, a lot of them are like, oh my God, science it's all wrong, all of it. You know, then that's not true. That's like an overreaction, right? But like, presumably, like priestly time science, like the guy who discovered oxygen, was accurate in the way I'm describing, and our stuff is accurate in the way that I'm describing, but you could easily discriminate and say a lot of the science happening now is more accurate, right? You can do that now, right? Because of what I just said, right? So it's totally cool. You're not in some kind of weird space where the most powerful, shouty person gets to tweet the thing that you have to believe.
Well, I guess I've got the microphone. It's on. Is it?
Yeah.
Oh, it is. Okay. So thank you so much.
You're so welcome.
It's been great. So a naive question, I guess, but it relates to just exactly what you were saying, and this idea of openness is, you know, when you brought up Ruskin and time, and I just wonder about withdrawal, and it seems like it's being presented as a certain thing. I use that with apprehension, but could there be a withdrawal at a certain time that's different than a withdrawal now? And I don't know, this like gnat's eyes or something, but I'm just wondering about that. Or is there a time when a withdrawal goes further or comes back and it's not withdrawn as much? That's the question.
The very simple, irritatingly short monosyllabic answer is no. There's never a more or less withdrawn. Withdrawal is fundamental ontological feature of how things are according to this argument. So, like, no matter what's happening, right? What's happening is happening on the level of what I'm calling access modes, right? Like, say the thing that's withdrawing is like being rained on right now. You know, the pattering rain is a kind of accessing of that thing, the pitter-patter sound and the wetness and the sort of thinking about rain and using it as an example in a desperate attempt to sound as clever as I just did in that previous answer, and it's really not working very well. And like, so this withdrawal is like, I'm not going to say permanent, because permanent, I don't believe in permanence. I believe in infinity, but I don't think permanence is correct, right? Anybody who's been in a relationship will know this. Like, infinity is true, right? But infinity doesn't mean going on and on and on forever. Infinity means you can't count it, right? Infinity means it might be 3, but for some reason you can't count. Like, your mind just melts when you sort of contemplate what it is. It could be 5 million, it could be 2. Infinite means you can't. It's a symptom of withdrawal, actually, infinity. It doesn't mean going on and on and on and on, right? And so things don't slightly withdraw or and then kind of come back or whatever. They're completely and utterly, like, encrypted, even from themselves, all the time, right? But funnily enough, that doesn't mean that nothing can happen and that you can't experience stuff. There's a paradox whereby, although the raindrop is withdrawn, I can still feel this wetness. I'm getting the raindrop data on me, you know. And that's true. Like, it's not candy flavored and it's not like sticky, it's raindroppy, right? And so it's true, that's true about raindrops, but that's not the raindrop, that's like human scaled, Tim scaled raindrop data falling on my head, right? And it's falling on my head because of the raindrops, it's real, right? But the actual raindrop, I'm never going to find it. I'm only ever going to find these like poems made out of raindrops and me, right? Like, when you read a poem, it's actually, where is the poem? Like, it's not on the page, is it? It's in here, right? The poem isn't over there. The poem's happening in here, right? Like, you read it, that's what makes it real. That's what brings it to life, right? So the poem isn't really a thing over there. It's it's a thing here that's like objective, but it's over here. Right, and in the same way the raindrop is objective, but it's over here. Kind of, yes. Right, like an event, like a process, like a rainbow, you know, kind of thing. Yeah. Really, really on the edge of completely wrong, you know. Yeah.
I mean, this is just a...
Did you say memory?
Memory.
Memory, yeah. Memory.
I was actually really happy when David started to ask this question about memory, and then it went down a political state, which is cool.
Yes.
But I'm actually trying to understand a little bit more about Triple O.
Yes.
And the question is, there is no static temporal state of an object, but if we're trying to understand or acknowledge that there is the essence of an object, when the physical embodiment of that object is gone, does the essence live on in memories? And that's not referring only to human memories. It's also like the physical imprints of that object in the ecology.
Yes, got it. So like, for example, my example that I often think about is like an opera singer singing a note that resonates with the resonant frequency of a glass, right? There's some really beautiful slow motion videos on YouTube you can see of this, right? And when the sound wave reaches the glass goes whoop, 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 like that, starts to reveal its basic sort of shimmery kind of disco quality, right? Then very quickly it's only just a memory of a glass, right? And the glass that exploded glass is nowhere to be seen. There's just these fragments of glass and like memory, glass memory. Not just glass memory, but like memories of glass in the shatter pattern, right, of the glass, the momentum, the trajectory of the glass and all that kind of stuff. You can read it in that pattern, right? And what this means is that the difference between the glass and everything that isn't the glass has collapsed, right? There's a really nice image about that in Tibetan Buddhism. Like it's the vase, right? Like when you die, it's like a vase breaking, and the space inside the vase becomes the space outside the vase. Suddenly, there's no difference, right? It's like that, yeah. Or the Freudian version: in every single-celled organism, there's a little chemical, like record, photograph, impression, poem about all the chemicals outside the cell. Right, like the chemicals inside the cell represent a certain state of chemicals outside the cell. If the chemicals inside the cell become completely the same as the chemicals outside the cell, that's called being dead. Right, like if you put enough cyanide into a cell, then the structure of the cell metabolism will collapse, right, and the chemicals will become the same as the environmental chemicals around it, totally disappear, right? And so then there's like the memory of there's the memory, right, of the cell, right? Now, the trouble is that actually, like, life isn't the opposite of that, right? Life isn't this thing that's like, I'm totally solid and and then at some point I'm going to break apart, right? Actually, life is like a kind of needle flickering between two different types of death, right? And this really has to do with memory, because the kind of memory that we, in our culture right now, hold on to a lot is endless machination, right? Like, my computer tells me that I'm giving a lecture at SCI-Arc every 5 minutes, this week. It's like ping, ping, like, and you have to put snooze on, right? And that's happening all the time, right? Like, my wallet is telling me stuff about how much money I don't have, and my phone is telling me who just called me, and that kind of thing is what Freud calls death drive. It's actually this maniacal machination, right? Round and round and round. And in our culture, we have like too much of that, funnily enough, right? Like, life kind of doesn't really have a chance to be the kind of quivery, sensitive thing that it actually is, right? Which is in between kind of just pure repetition and not existing at all, yeah? This would be why actually memory in a way is always a little bit distorted or fuzzy, right? Because it's not really in a pure repetition domain, right? And it doesn't really not exist at all. It's in this kind of flickering space in between, yeah? So I'm sort of finger painting the beginnings of an answer to your question. Now you're going to have to remind me what the question was, because I got so excited about flickering stuff. Right. Right. Yes. Yes, it does, exactly. And in fact, how can it do that? Because the form of the thing itself is a kind of memory, right? Like, how the thing appears actually is the past, according to this logic, right? Like, not just because of the speed of light. Like, this T-shirt is a story about what happened to this T-shirt. You know, luckily it didn't get stained with anything apart from in a factory of American Apparel. You know, I hope. But like, everything is like a story about what happened to something, right? Everything is a kind of memory chip, in a way, right? Like, this stage is a memory of stuff that happened to this stuff. It got walked on, it got constructed, it got filmed, you know, it got talked about, right? And so the memory can live on in you because already the memory is living on in the thing itself, right? And that actually what the thing really is the future, right? The basic logic is that the way things appear is the past, and what the thing actually is the future. So it's sort of like, what is the meaning of the poem? The ultimate meaning of the poem is the future. It's always like off the edge of somewhere, right? And so also the meaning of the sentence, right? You have no idea how this sentence is going to end. Elephant, banana, sausage, Pope. Has it ended yet? Octopus, squiggle, seaweed, right? Like, you don't know yet, right? But so the meaning of the sentence is haunting the sentence. It's like the spectre of the sentence is the meaning, right? In the same way, math, actual math, you know, is the ghost of the computation, right? Like, the funny paradox is that we have computation because we have math, but whenever you look for math, all you find is computation. But you just said that you just heard the correct thing. Computation is secondary to math. Math is logically prior to computation, but you can't really look for it. You can't really find it anywhere. You can only find like algorithmic simulations of it called computation, right? It's the same kind of idea. So whenever you look for the real stage, you're only going to find the stage memory. But that doesn't mean there isn't a real one, that actually there's a kind of dislocation between the stage memory and the stage, right? And this is why you can have memories in you of the stage. Yes. Mm. Could be. I might want to go further though and say actually the T-shirt itself is a distortion of the T-shirt. The actual T-shirt itself, the T-shirt appearance, is a distortion of the T-shirt. Yeah. So the reason why we can have all these funny different impressions and ideas about what Tim's wearing is because the T-shirt itself isn't completely true. Yeah. And so it's not the case that if you kind of amalgamated all these things, then you get the actual T-shirt. What you'd have then was a massive amalgam of T-shirt impressions, right? You'd have an enormous anthology of all the kind of stuff that you were thinking everyone in this room, oh my God, about this T-shirt. Yeah, and you wouldn't actually have the actual T-shirt there. You'd have an amalgam, and probably there'd be some kind of best fit curve between all of those points, right? All of those data points, yeah? But that wouldn't be the T-shirt. It would be a best fit curve between T-shirt data points, right? I'm so sorry. I'm never going to give you the real T-shirt. You can't have it. It's mine. Yeah. Yeah. Actual clever people. Yeah. Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Right on. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Right on. Can I talk about metaphor? Yeah, of course I can talk about metaphor for hours and hours, and like, so the Latin translation of the word metaphor is the word translation. Right, the trans is meta, and the lation is the for bit. It means carrying across, right, or whatever. But translation is kind of like how we see what causality is, how we imagine causality, right? Like this stage set is a translation of various materials and various ideas about stage sets and stuff translated into this, right? So, funnily enough, metaphor isn't a kind of superficial thing. Now, that's very difficult for us to accept because for the last 500 years, European linguists and philosophers have mostly chopped logic away from rhetoric, right? First of all, like science is totally different from that. That's Peter Ramus around like 1600, right? And then a couple of hundred years later, they decided that rhetoric was just style, right? It's just the third part, right? And then within that, the bastards decided that style was just tropes, like metaphor, right? And then somewhere down the line, probably because it's very easy to teach it in a 50-minute class, metaphor became the trope, right? And so I'm not hooked that much on that kind of metaphor because that's a kind of decorative thing, right? So funnily enough, just like you said, when I use the word metaphor, I'm using it metaphorically, Jesus Christ, to convey something about translation, yeah? And you may have noticed that because I'm not actually intelligent, like Graham and Slavoj, I have to fumble my way towards this stuff in a kind of touchy-feely way, right? Where the truth of what I'm saying is kind of always a little bit off in the distance, which is really peed off. Talking of golden stains, my Penguin editor, my Verso editor was fine, but my Penguin editor was sort of like, you have to clarify this, what does it mean? And it got worse and worse and worse for her, more and more and more and more difficult, to the point where I had to say, look, just trust me, please just trust me, because you're like actually causing my prose to be completely diluted. This isn't me anymore, and you wanted a book by me, you're going to have to deal with this kind of fumbly, free associative thing that I do, you know. So sort of like, to me that's how stuff happens, yeah, and also very conveniently, it's like how I can't help writing when I'm like relaxed, you know. Kind of, it could be in a funny way, like it's supposedly it's like a very time laggy metaphor, like it's never a completely one-to-one metaphor for the base, like the economic structure that's happening right now. There's all these features in it that are like artifacts of stuff that happened 1,000 years ago in it, kind of thing. So like the way we talk about it is affected, distorted by all those artifacts, right? And unfortunately this also affects Marxist interpretations of what the superstructure actually is. It's full of these weird artifacts that aren't actually accurate, yeah? He said provocatively, you know. And like, so the point would be to sort of try to get rid of those, yeah?
Okay.
Metaphor.
Oh my God. I have a question too.
On that highly ambiguous. Oh, look, here's a chap with a microphone.
Okay. Okay. I'm still trying to phrase my question in my head because there are multiple topics you brought up in your lecture that I want to touch on, and topics that came up in the questions. Specifically, Todd's question regarding the building in itself.
Yes.
And the contrast with the author, and then how it's interpreted, and then
yes.
how you talked about it, time kind of spilling out of the building.
Yes.
And my question specifically, I keep coming back to the word power.
Yes.
And how there's pivotal moments of the object when it has slightly more influence, and that's tied up with the the Marxist dialogue you kept on referencing. But it's also tied with the medium at which the poem is written on.
Yes.
And that certain mediums might be more that if you get closer to the essence of the object, or closer to what the author's intention, that there might be a more tight-knit power dialogue.
May I jump in for a second?
Yeah,
That's what you can't do. You can never get closer. It's always going to recede, like the way when you chase the moon, it's always going to be like over there because of the parallax, right? What you can do in terms of accuracy is describe the effect, right? You can never answer the question, why did the author put this particular feature of this thing over here, right? But you can answer the question, what kind of effect is this having on these specific beings, for example, me or this bunch of flies over here? That you can do accurately. But funnily enough, you can't. And another issue is that you can never specify like this power pivot moment completely and totally, because the power pivot moment is keyed to a particular kind of being. You know, like for this little colony of ants that live in the attic of this thing, the power pivot moment was the bit when the dude who owned the house burned them, right? But that's not the power pivot moment for the dude. Was the moment for the dude is when the mortgage money ran out, right? And the bit that was the pivot for the tree that was undermining the foundation of it was the bit when it went, oh yes, I can live now more, and this thing that's getting in the way is like toppled over, right? And so different beings are going to have different power pivot moments, right? And the problem with the Marxist one is that they're only looking at one kind of power pivot moment. It's a great new flavor of Ben & Jerry's ice cream we've just invented, a power pivot moment. ppm, parts per million, is only ever key to humans, actually, right? And it doesn't have to be. In fact, it works much better if it's like potentially keyed to everything, funnily enough. But you have to drop a certain kind of concept that humans are specially different and like human economics makes things real. Because actually everything economics makes things real, and everything economics is what they used to call ecology. Before the guy Haeckel came up with the word ecology, it was called the economy of nature, right? Which simply means interactions between lots of different entities. You know, some of them are human, some of them are like dolphins or whatever, but there's like dolphin economics, right? And they intersect with human economics sometimes.
That does answer my question, so thank you.
Wow. Thank you so much.